Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Go Big Read evening. This is my favorite event of the year, and I'm delighted that you're all here to discuss our 2019 book, Poison Squad. It's a great read. It takes a lot of people working behind the scenes to organize this big a book club every year, and I want to particularly thank three people who led that effort. Lisa Carter, the Vice Provost for University Libraries, Sheila Steckel, who directs our library teaching and learning programs, and Instruction and Outreach Librarian Jules Ehrensdorf. I also Professor Hemant Shaw, the Director of the School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Professor Shaw is the Helen Furstbrook Franklin Professor of Journalism, the same faculty chair that Deborah Blum once held. He is going to facilitate what I know is going to be a very lively discussion of the book after the author finishes her remarks. Choosing Go Big Read each year is one of the really fun parts of my job, and I chose The Poison Squad for at least 4 reasons. First, it is a book that shows how important science can be in shaping policy. The book chronicles this clash between science, business, and politics that seems particularly relevant today as we face a strong anti-science movement that influences popular opinion. For all of our students who major in science-related topics, and that is about half of the student body, this book shows how important scientific work can be. Secondly, it's a book that demonstrates what useful government regulation looks like. Too often today, there is a knee-jerk reaction against any government involvement, and this book demonstrates why laws and regulations are sometimes needed for our health and safety. Indeed, the headlines from last month about the deaths and illnesses caused by vaping could be a chapter in this book. It is a product whose contents are entirely unregulated. Third, the book tells the story of how one individual, Harvey Wiley, can have a huge impact. Without Dr. Wiley's persistence, scientific skill, and political savvy, our world would be less safe. The book reminds us that we do have agency as human beings. Our actions and our involvement in the issues of the world can make a difference. And fourth and last, UW-Madison is a national leader in food safety research. Our Food Research Institute is the oldest academic program in the country focused on food safety. It connects food companies across the state, the country, and the world with UW-Madison's food safety experts. In short, UW-Madison and Wisconsin, as those of you who've read the book know, are part of this story. We distributed 7,000 copies of The Poison Squad to new students at Convocation last month, and we have 200+ course sections reading the book. That's more than 5,000 students in classes ranging from history to journalism to veterinary bacteriology. Community groups in Dane County and around the state are also reading and discussing the book. It's been checked out of the Madison Public Library 500 times, and there are currently 350 people on the waiting list. The e-book and audiobook have been downloaded from the library's site more than 450 times. And as some of you know, Wisconsin Public Radio is featuring the book on its Chapter a Day program this month, and you can tune in every day to hear the next chapter or go to their website to catch up on the chapters that you've missed. I'm delighted to see members of the community along with faculty, staff, and students joining us this evening. We're in for a fascinating discussion, but before we hear from author Deborah Blum, let me tell you just a little bit about her. She set out to be a chemist, but she says, quote, "A laboratory is no place for the absent-minded klutz." She changed her major the day she set her hair on fire with a Bunsen burner. Professor Blum graduated from the University of Georgia with a journalism degree and worked for several newspapers, then decided to combine her love of writing and her fascination with science. She came to UW-Madison as a graduate student in the journalism school, where she was encouraged to study the history of science. After a career as a science reporter, in which she won a Pulitzer Prize for her series on ethical issues in primate research, she returned to UW and joined our journalism faculty. She taught here for 18 years before leaving UW-Madison 4 years ago, our loss. She now directs the Night Science Journalism program at MIT. Deborah is the author of a number of books that explore the relationships between science and society in new and fascinating ways. And having read The Poison Squad, I invite you to sample some of the others as well. Please join me in a warm welcome for Deborah Blum.
you. I want to start, you probably guessed that some of my friends from my years in Madison are here in the audience, but I really want to start by saying how wonderful it is for me back here at the University of Wisconsin. The university, I got my graduate degree as that Chancellor Blank says here. It was transformative for me in a number of ways. It made me a much smarter, more thoughtful journalist. It encouraged me to think about science and the history of science and the paths that take us to where we are today, which is one of the things I want to talk about today. And being a professor in one of the best journalism schools in the country, and it is still that today, was a enlightening, illuminating, and wonderful experience. I'm very grateful for my years here, and I'm very happy to be back. And this morning I went for a long walk with a friend along Lake Mendota, and I said to myself, why did I leave exactly? Right? It was just gorgeous. So with that, though, I'm going to kind of take you into the story of my book and what brought me there. This is the cover of the book. If you look down at the bottom, you'll see Harvey Wiley, who is the focus of my story, in the middle. But what I really want to talk to you is a little bit about how I came to this point and what brought me here. And I didn't actually start this book thinking about food safety. I'm a writer who really loves, anyone who knows me knows that I'm a writer who really loves poisonous things. And my previous book, The Poisoner's Handbook, was about the invention of forensic toxicology. For almost 2 years, I wrote a digital column for the New York Times called Poison Pen. I'm really interested only in things that are bad for you, right? And so, but while I was looking at the history of this area around Poisoner's Handbook, which is also set in the early 20th century, I kept hearing about this experiment which was nicknamed the Poison Squad. And I started thinking about that experiment, and I'm going to come back to it in particular, which is an experiment which I'm going to oversimplify at the moment by saying this is an experiment in which a chemist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture decides that the only way that he can really look at what makes food safe and what doesn't is to deliberately poison his coworkers. And it is one of the strangest, and he does it too. It's actually one of the strangest experiments in the history of science. So when I was reading about it, I started thinking, well, why would you do that? Why would you be so desperate? Why would you need to prove your point by actually designing an experiment, and will you put the lives of young workers at the Department of Agriculture at risk? And once I started looking at that, that led me into the story that I'm about to explore with you now. So one of the things I realized when I started is that we've all kind of bought into a mythology about the wonderful, healthy food of the 19th century. At least I did. I had this idea that in the 19th century, people just had wonderful farm-fresh, healthy products. They were all pink-cheeked and healthy. They were practically picking the apples off their backyard trees and drinking foaming, creamy milk and all of the above. And that turns out to be a complete misrepresentation of the 19th century. And in fact, there's a medical historian at the University of Michigan, Howard Merkel, who describes the 19th century as the century of the great American stomachache. And in fact, I was down, I gave a talk about this book. I gave did a day of talks and meetings at the FDA about 2 weeks ago, and one of the things their historians brought up is that the calculation for the 19th century is that food, just eating food, was one of the top 10 causes of death in the 19th century. And if you look at any of the top 10 causes of death today, you're not going to see your daily diet on there, right, in any obvious way. So what was really going on? So I kind of love, this is actually from a book cover of a book that was published in London in the 1820s. And so what I really want to say to you is in the 19th century, one of the things that I started to realize is food is completely unregulated, right? Especially, there's no rules for food safety. There's no federal laws, and in fact, in 1820, none in the United States at all, for consumer protection. And so people who are manufacturing food can do actually anything they want with it. And this book is considered, this particular book was written by a chemist named Frederick Ackham. He's sort of considered the father of food safety in the 19th century. And he was really focused on poisonous metals in food. And so to give you an example, if you were buying red candy in the 19th century, that was usually colored with red lead. And if you were buying yellow candy, that would have been lead chromate, which made a beautiful yellow. And if you were buying green candy, that would have been arsenic. And I can tell you as someone arsenic is my favorite poison, but I know it makes me sound creepy, but it is. But arsenic makes a gorgeous green, and so there were all kinds of uses of arsenic as a green dye, including candy. And what happens in England then is that about in 1850, some over-enthusiastic candy maker put so much arsenic in the candy that actually about 24 children die. It was called the Bradford Incident. And after that, Britain passes its first food safety law that just says, really, before you put things like arsenic in the food, you should probably safety test them a little. It was a pretty benign law, but at least it was there. And you start seeing this spreading across Europe, the realization that manufacturers are putting bad things in food, but this does not happen in the United States. There are no laws, there is no actual regulation of anything going into food. In 1883, Harvey Wiley comes to the USDA in Washington, D.C., and the USDA is really important because at this point, there is no FDA. There are no agencies, in fact, that take any look at food as an issue. And the only agency that has it in its mission in any way is the USDA, and the USDA has never looked at it, right? They have this tiny Bureau of Chemistry. This is, in fact, the entire Bureau of Chemistry for the United States of America in 1883, and they have these tiny group of chemists, and they're responsible for all the food chemistry and agriculture. And the previous director of this lab had said, we don't have time to do food safety, but Wiley, who had come from Indiana, where he'd been very involved in looking at food fraud when he was a professor at Purdue, said, no, I really want to look at this. And so this is actually him. I'm going to stand under him. If you got the book, you've seen this picture, but he's the really tall guy, kind of with the kind of cowboy attitude at the front. And so he comes in and he says, I want to actually just know what's in the food supply. That's all I want to do. I'm going to put you to work looking at this. And they start doing, they were called Bulletin 13s, this series of reports on the American food supply. And at first, no one questioned this, why not? And so they start putting these out, and as they do them, and they do dairy products, they do meat, canned vegetables, they do lard, they do coffee and tea and alcoholic beverages, and just the whole range of the food supply, they start building this really appalling portrait of what's in the American food supply in this period where anyone can do whatever they want. And I'm just going to talk about a couple examples of this now, both the fraudulent ones and the poisonous ones. So one of the things they did, and I wanted to mention it briefly, is they picked up from the British looking at the use of heavy metals in candy. And this photograph on this side is of a candy factory from the late 19th century. There was, aside from the fact that there was no safety testing, there was no one going in there and saying, you should probably make this in a clean environment. So this was a very standard candy factory of the time. And this is actually a page from one of Wiley's inspectors that he sent out. And if you can read the lettering right in the middle, you're going to see it's talking about children dying, because they were having the same problems in the United States as they were in Europe, that the toxic metals in candy was actually killing children. These were big, cheap penny candies, right? Bright red, bright green, bright yellow, and they were dangerous. So they start to kind of document this, but they look at other things. So ask yourself for a minute what nutritive coffee might actually be, right? Because I have no idea. And one of the things that was really important also in this area is because there's no legislation at all, there's no requirement for labels. So people can put any label they want to on a food product, and they can put whatever they want to in it, and they can call it anything. So coffee makes a great case study. If you go over here to this one, which is coffee essence, right? That had no coffee in it, right? It's essence of coffee, right? I'm actually not sure what that means, but if you bought it, you might actually think you were getting some coffee, right? But actually, most of these didn't have coffee in it. When Wiley's chemists did their investigations of coffee in the 19th century, what they found was that, in general, it contained some coffee, some ground burnt rope, sawdust that was usually dyed black with lead, charred bones, ground shells, floor sweepings, actually. I mean, when you actually read these Bulletin 13s, you're just kind of going, whoa. So what's really interesting about this is there's no requirement for anyone to put what they say into the can. But there starts to be this kind of underground realization that the coffee is not really perking you up in the morning. So people start shifting over to coffee beans, right? And so then there becomes a new industry in fake coffee beans. And you can actually go and you can find those kind of circulars that go out to manufacturers in which they say, here's how you can really increase your profit. And this is a time, if you can imagine it, or kind of go back in that kind of picture of time where a lot of grocery stores just had big barrels of products, a barrel of flour, a barrel of coffee beans, right? They would scoop them up for you. So the grocer would be encouraged to just mix in some of these fake beans. And the fake beans were largely wax and dirt. And so, but you would mix them in, and then you could really increase your profits because coffee beans were expensive. And I actually read this one article by a doctor in Indiana who said that he had finally decided that the origin of the phrase, a muddy cup of coffee, came from the fact that Americans drank so much dirt every morning, right? And I started thinking to myself, well, what did things actually taste like in the 19th century, right? If you were never getting what you thought was in the can or the container, what were you actually getting? Spices were worse, right? Which is kind of hard to imagine, but Wiley's chemists used to call pepper pepperette. And again, it was a lot of ground, different non-pepper products. They actually ran a sting on the McCormick Spice Company regarding their pepper. They knew that McCormick was mysteriously importing tons and tons of coconut shells, and they couldn't figure out exactly what they were doing with them. So some of Wiley's inspectors went out and they sprayed the coconut shells on the docks, I think it was in New Jersey or New York, with quinine. And then they waited, and then they started testing McCormick pepper for quinine, and sure enough, it was loaded with quinine. And so that was one of the rare investigations where they actually nailed the producer. Red things like cloves and cinnamon were usually about 50% or so brick dust. What was the other one that I used to really like? So brick dust. Oh, and then gypsum was used in flour, right, to extend flour. So you started seeing, as this starts getting out, people just doing this. It's a pure spice. I'm actually not sure what that means, right? But you start seeing manufacturers starting to say, whatever is in it, it's definitely pure, right? And you see it with whiskey, too. There was a lot of faking of whiskey. People would take ethanol, industrial ethanol, which is easily synthesized alcohol, and then you could go out on the market and you could buy essence of brandy, essence of scotch, essence of bourbon, and you could actually buy an additive that would make it like cling to the glass like a good whiskey, and they would go out and sell it as an aged whiskey. So you start seeing manufacturers doing this, not blended, not adulterated, sold in only bottles, never sold in bulk, because there's so much now awareness that things are never what they seem. It's legal, but they're never what they seem. I want to briefly mention, although it's not really the focus, that at the same time you have this fairly insane deal with over-the-counter drugs and medications, snake oil meds, but you also have this. Vin Mariani was cocaine wine, because wine didn't give you enough of a buzz. And in this particular case, and this is actually legitimate, the Pope really thought this was great, and he blessed the cocaine wine, which is a big hit. And this is one of the early ads for Coca-Cola, which, as you know, got its name from the fact that it was a cocaine drink. And many of Wiley and his crew took a long look at medicated soft drinks. You know, the name of 7-Up comes from the fact that 7-Up had a lot of lithium and it pepped you up. But Coca-Cola here, you see, has the stimulant properties of the coca plant. And it is delicious, and it's also invigorating, right? And it'll cure anything: sick headache, neuralgia, hysteria, melancholy. And so, and all of this is just, you know, you go down to the soda fountain and you get your Coca-Cola. So there's no regulation of anything in this way, right? And so I want to move from just some of the lunacy of it to an example of why this was also dangerous. And this is a cartoon that was done by a very famous political cartoonist, Thomas Nash, who was best known for his cartoons about corrupt politicians. But in this case, he's doing a cartoon of a corrupt dairyman. So as I said, a lot of people would shop at markets. They would go, they would get their products dipped. This actually is a market where you have a dairyman selling milk. And although in this case, as you see, the dairyman is a skeleton. And people would go, they would bring, as this mom is doing, her pitcher, and he would dip the milk into it. So why is that? Why is the dairyman actually a skeleton in this case, right? Here's another Nash cartoon that gets at part of that. And this is, you see the cart, Pure Country Milk, and you see the dairyman behind watering down the milk. So the standard practice in the 19th century was, you know, why sell a gallon of pure milk when you could get 3 gallons of watered milk and make a lot more money? And it was 3 to 4 gallons of milk for every gallon that you actually had. And so what they would do, because the milk would get very thin and blue, is they would then recolor the milk with either plaster of Paris or chalk. And then, in some cases, this was again one of my favorite stories out of Indiana, there were dairymen who'd say, you know, I have these calves and they didn't survive and I don't know what to do with the brains. And so they would puree the brains and they could float them on top of the milk and they would look like cream. And so, and this was great, except when you poured it into your hot cup of coffee, the brains would actually cook in the milk, and people kept finding these little floating balls, right? So occasionally they would detect it. And the other thing is that the milk itself didn't have to be that clean. No one was saying, well, if you're going to water the milk, at least use sterile water, right? So in one case, and I think this was also in the Midwest, this family came down to their local health department. They had a bottle of milk and it was wiggling. And when they actually did the analysis, they discovered the milk was full of horsehair worms and that the dairyman had just gone to the local swamp pond and scooped up that water. So the milk was dirty. It was thin to the point that it often didn't have enough nutrition. And of course, this is in the days before real refrigeration, and it's in the days before pasteurization. The United States was very slow to pasteurization of milk compared to Europe, and so the milk was a great substrate for pathogenic bacteria, and a lot of people just died from the bacteria in the milk. But one other thing started happening with milk. During the Civil War, people discovered a new and amazing embalming agent called formaldehyde. It was synthesized very effectively by Germans in the mid-19th century, and because there were so many corpses during the Civil War, they discovered they could efficiently preserve those corpses with formaldehyde. So literally, the American dairy industry thought, hey. Well, I don't know if they thought, hey, but they, but I'm thinking, hey. But what they did think is this looks like an amazing agent for preserving rotting material. What if we put it in the milk, which is always decomposing in an annoying and less profitable way? And so they started coming up with formulas in which they would put formaldehyde in the milk to preserve it. And in fact, it worked really well, right? It was so effective that you can find advertisements from this period in the late 19th century in which dairy farmers are saying, buy my milk because you can put it out on the counter, it'll be fine for 2 weeks, right? I mean, today we're kind of like you, but at that time, this is the miracle of science, right? Chemistry is just becoming this amazing, powerful force, and everyone was dazzled by the idea of milk that never died. And so this becomes a very widespread practice. The formaldehyde formulas are never called formaldehyde, of course. They're called preservaline or rosaline or, something that sounds really innocuous. And the only problem is there's no rules about how much of this you can use, right? So a lot of dairymen start thinking, well, if a little formaldehyde is good, how about if I use a little more? And so you start seeing stories in newspapers like this, which they called embalmed milk scandals, right? And this one's from Omaha, but you see them all across the country. I collected a whole folder of them in which you have problems where the dairymen have gotten carried away with the formaldehyde in the milk and children get sick or die. And in Indianapolis, in one summer, I want to say it was about 1899, they had 400 children die from embalmed milk, but no one's prosecuted because it's legal, right? There's nothing, right? There's no laws that say you can't do this. And finally, I just want to briefly mention meat. This is a very romantic-looking postcard from Swift. The Chicago meat, the meat packing industry was largely based in Chicago, some in Wisconsin, and the big ones were Swift, Armour, Cudahy, and they all had huge meat packing plants in Chicago. And during the Spanish-American War, they were accused of embalming beef by some of the generals, and there was a huge scandal about this. Here is a cartoon from Puck in which you see the beef trust looking very charming there, and deodorized ham and embalmed sausages and purified pork and all of these other horrible meat products. But what was really interesting about that is when the Army had its hearing at the War Department, what they concluded was that the military was not responsible for this horrible meat. Teddy Roosevelt, who was then governor of New York, actually testified and said that he had forced one of his soldiers to eat some of the canned meat, and the soldier had started throwing up. And he had eventually realized that the meat was so bad he would rather eat his hat. But the conclusion of the actual hearing was that, oh, well, this is just what everyone's getting in the grocery store anyway, so it's not our fault, right? Which was true. There was really bad meat out in the American country. So Wiley, meanwhile, has been doing all of these tests, and he's been working and working and working to try to get some kind of regulation. His big argument for a long time was, let's just label things. There are people who are sick. They shouldn't be eating formaldehyde. There are children who should not be eating these products. Let's at least tell people what's in them, but he was never able to get that passed because of industry opposition to labeling anything. And he was never able, he worked with Congress on a number of attempts to get any kind of food safety bill and drug and drink, and nothing passed. Everything got shot down. And so finally in 1902, he was so fed up, he said, okay, and this brings us to the Poison Squad, why don't we actually look at these things? Why don't we actually get some scientific evidence of what they are? And this is a publicity photo from that Poison Squad experiment, which I particularly love because if we do a publicity photo today, we don't let the trash stay on the floor. And I'm always looking at it and saying, you know, they were so much more chill about that kind of thing, apparently. But this is actually a photo of the dining room that he created, and these are some of the young clerks at the Department of Agriculture. So what they did was they built a dining room and a special kitchen in the basement of the Department of Agriculture, and they advertised this nationally, and they made a basic deal with these young men. And he picked young men, many of them had been college athletes, because he thought that they were, in his early 20th century way, he thought they were the like sturdiest specimens, and he didn't want to kill anyone, right? He wanted to try to get people in this experiment who could withstand whatever he was going to feed them, because the way this experiment is set up is you get 3 free meals a day, 7 days a week in this dining room. And it's all amazing, farm fresh, wonderful food, no preservatives, no anything. They hired a professional chef from a fancy hotel, and the only issue is you have to get all kinds of medical tests, right? And half of the room at any given time is also going to be swallowing capsules that have whatever food additive he is studying at the time. He started with, I don't know if you've ever been in the kitchen, in the grocery store and in the cleaning department, you'll see 20 Mule Team Borax, which is a cleaning product. That was a very popular food preservative at the time. And so he started with borax. He did formaldehyde. They had to call that experiment early because so many people got sick. Copper sulfate, which was used to green vegetables. Salicylic acid, which we know from aspirin, which was used largely as a preservative in beer and wine. And what's really interesting about salicylic acid is that if you go over to Germany, they've banned its use in Germany. They think it's too destructive to the lining of the stomach. But all the German beer imported to the United States has salicylic acid in it because it's fine here, right? So he starts working his way through these things, and he starts with borax. And he said he started with borax because he thought it would be safe, and instead people get really sick. And when he later testified to Congress about it, he said he found himself converted by his evidence, that he had started out just arguing for let's label, let's give more information, let's try to restrict some of these, and these experiments in particular changed him from being an objective scientist into a sort of full-bore crusader. He had to get this out. He thought that the American food supply was really physically harming people, and because there's no one but him in the federal government doing this, he felt personally responsible. And he was a holy roller kind of chemist, right? His dad had been a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and he had been raised with this idea of science and the service of good. So you see him getting more and more and more combative about this. These studies he actually called the hygienic table trials, but the Washington Post called them the Poison Squad, and that stuck, and so you start seeing coverage all around the country, as you do here with the New York Times. And if you look at this very early 20th century sort of deck of headlines, my favorite is Professor Wiley held the microscope while the volunteer victims wriggled, right? But when you get down into the text, it's poison, 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 and what these stories, and they're in papers across the country, they're in minstrel shows, they're in songs, I mean, it really caught on, and everyone is starting to realize that, in fact, the food supply is really dangerous, and the system that they were told they should be able to trust is not trustworthy at all. However, nothing still happens, and Wiley realizes that what he needs is even more advocates. And one of the things that made him so interesting is that he would work with anyone who he thought would be a real supporter of his cause. So this kind of goofy-looking illustration is actually from a piece I did for National Geographic about Henry J. Heinz. But I love this story, so I'm going to stop and tell it to you for just a minute. So most big industrialists fought Wiley tooth and nail. They repeatedly tried to get him fired. There's all kinds of different things where everyone thinks he's going to lose his job. But one of the people who didn't was Henry J. Heinz. And he was one of the biggest condiment manufacturers in the country at this point. He had a huge mansion in Pittsburgh, along with many of the other industrialists of the time, and his main factory was in Pittsburgh. But he was very interested in the idea of food without preservatives. And when Wiley started talking about this, he said, I wonder if we can make a preservative-free ketchup. And ketchup at the time in the 19th century was not the ketchup that we use today. It was a kind of thin mixed vegetable sauce, not always vegetable. So a lot of the American ketchup of the time was pumpkin rinds, right? Some of them kind of rotten, apples that had been, the peels from apples, whatever sort of vegetable refuse that people could get their hands on, and they would stew it up into a thin sauce, and then they would dye it red with a coal tar dye and add some spices. And then they would add a preservative, sodium benzoate, which we use a lot still today. And so Heinz said, what if I can make a ketchup that didn't need the sodium benzoate, right? Which was one of the preservatives that Wiley looked at. And he went to his general manager and he said, I want to make a preservative-free ketchup. And his general manager said, you don't want to do that because we have a money-back guarantee. And so if we start doing this and the ketchup rots in the bottle, we're going to lose a whole lot of money. And he said, absolutely, I still want to try this. So the Heinz food chemists started really experimenting with ketchup. And they finally realized that what they needed was vinegar, because the acid in vinegar is bacteria filling, and they needed a lot of tomato pulp because there's a lot of acid in tomatoes. And so they made this new ketchup, which was very thick. And in fact, it was hard to get out of the bottle because it was so thick. And that ketchup became the modern ketchup, right? So in the course of supporting the pure food movement, what was called the pure food movement, Heinz invented modern ketchup. But he also sent his chemists to the White House to lobby Teddy Roosevelt. He actually had his publicists plant bad stories about the competition and their evil use of preservatives. He was very involved in this. And the other group of allies that I want to mention regarding Wiley, because it's so interesting given the time period, was women. Wiley actually married a suffragette late in his life who was arrested picketing the Woodrow Wilson White House in support of women's votes and served 5 days in jail for it. And he really believed that even though women didn't have the vote, which they certainly didn't at the turn of the 20th century in a national sense, there were some Western states that allowed the vote, but there was no voting rights for women in national elections. He still thought they had power, which is really unusual. He thought, and he said, that he thought women were the best organizers he knew, and that they would create women's clubs, and they were actually changing things. And so he would go out night after night and talk about the food issue to different women's groups, and they became some of his best allies. And he later said they would never have gotten that law through if it hadn't been for all the women who stood by and said, we want this to change, right? And it's really interesting. You actually see women who are writing cookbooks at the time, like Fanny Farmer, in her turn of the 20th century cookbooks. They'll do whole sections on fake food, or Fanny Farmer in one of her cookbooks wrote a chapter on the fact that milk was really dangerous and shouldn't be served to invalids. So you see all of this kind of work by women to also educate about what a problem this is. Still, they are not able to get any change. They get lots of publicity. Wiley becomes a beloved national figure, right? There's all these cartoons, admiring him, his sure cure for adulterations, fake foods, quack remedies. But what really changes things, what really, despite all of this public pressure, nothing changes until a socialist writer and journalist named Upton Sinclair writes a book called The Jungle. And the story of the jungle is really interesting because, and I'm almost out of time here, Upton Sinclair was a dedicated socialist. He was a very poor writer. This book was first serialized in a socialist newspaper from Kansas called Appeal to Reason, because Kansas was a hotbed of socialism in the early 20th century, right? And so, hard to believe today, but it was the #1 socialist state in the country, and this National Socialist newspaper was published there, and he pitched this novel about the Chicago meat workers. He had been gotten interested in a strike there, and they bought it. And so in 1905, the Appeal to Reason publishes The Jungle in serial form in a socialist newspaper. And he had also had a contract with Macmillan. And Macmillan looks at this book and hates it, right? Because Upton Sinclair, and this is why it became so influential, had done a very journalistic thing, and he had gone to Chicago and he had lived in a settlement house and spent weeks in the packing houses, and he had all these incredibly grisly details about meat production, right? The rats that were poisoned and went into the sausage, and the rotting meat that was washed off with borax and went out for production. And in his novel, of course, the workers who end up in the lard when they fall into the lye tanks. I mean, so there, but it's a really horrifying look at food production, and he very famously said that when he wrote this book, which was about the plight of workers, he aimed for America's heart and hit it in the stomach, right? This book comes out, and his publisher, even though his first publisher had canceled it, it gets picked up by Doubleday Page, and they fact-check it. It's so inflammatory, they send their own fact-checking team to Chicago, and their fact-checking team comes back and says it's worse than in the book. So they decide to go ahead and publish the book, and when it comes out, they send an autographed copy to Teddy Roosevelt, and he is looking at this book. This book is taking off. It's starting to become a scandal. He sends a fact-checking team to Chicago, and they come back and they say it's worse than in the book. And they write a report that has never been published. It's still in an archive at USDA. But what happens is Roosevelt says to Congress, I want a Meat Inspection Act. And if you don't give me a Meat Inspection Act, I'm going to release this report. And Congress, which is getting a lot of money from the meat industry, says, yeah, no. And so he then releases 8 pages of the report. And the 8 pages that he released, and they're really gruesome, caused such a scandal that every country in Europe cancels their contracts with the United States. People quit buying meat, and he gets, in June of 1906, the Meat Inspection Act. And 2 weeks later, in this rush of outrage about the state of the American food supply, the Food and Drug Act passed. So both of them passed in June 1906, and this is a paradigm-changing moment. It's the first time the federal government has ever passed a law, a consumer protection law, ever. It lays down the principle that when in our Constitution, when we say promote the general welfare, we don't just mean, arm our borders. We mean we protect people in their everyday lives. That what we eat and drink and breathe matters, and that the government is actually in the business of making sure that safety standards are set. Wiley, and I write a lot about this in the book, then gets involved in trying to actually implement the law. It's the first time that American businesses have ever been held to safety standards. And what he discovers fairly rapidly is that although he thinks this is going to be an amazing consumer-first world, in fact, there are a lot of secret handshakes between government and industry, and the law is rapidly very much watered down and not nearly as effective as he hopes, and his enemies both in business and in the government, eventually manufacture a fake scandal in which he survives, but then he realizes that he cannot stay in government. He leaves. He goes on to Good Housekeeping, where he establishes good housekeeping testing laboratories and something called the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval. And he writes this column, Common Mistakes About Food, in which you can find these letters in which his editors are saying, why are you teaching women all this chemistry? They're not smart enough to get it. And he's going, they totally are, and I'm teaching them all the chemistry they need. And so the column itself is pretty progressive. And eventually, as you see here, he's recognized as the father of the Food and Drug Act. I want to move us briefly forward to today, and then I'm happy to answer any questions. So both my previous book, Poisoner's Handbook, and this book are taught in a lot of high school chemistry classes as a way to make people think about chemistry, or students get interested in chemistry. And a high school teacher in Colorado sent me this particular slide from an experiment he did with his students, in which you see the can of giant green peas. And over to one side, you see the kind of grayish green peas, right? What he did is he took copper sulfate, which was the greening metal compound that was used in Wiley's day, and he mixed it into the peas. And so the beautiful green, fresh peas are actually peas that contain a lot of copper. And then what he did, and if you can see it over here, is he took a nail and he just ground up made a slurry of those copper-enriched peas and stuck the nail in it head down. And if you look, you can see the copper redepositing on the nail, because when you mix these things into the food, they don't just stay there, right? And so he uses this in part to talk to his students about why we don't want these things in our food. And that's going to lead me briefly to a couple of points I want to make about today. So the 1906 Act, because it was so watered down, eventually brought us to a system that is used by our government. It's called the Generally Recognized as Safe GRAS principle, in which our government, a lot of times when they're trying to make a decision about what's safe in food or not, they don't actually study it. They'll just say, well, that's generally recognized as safe. And so no one died, right? And so an example of that in the food supply would be titanium dioxide, which is used as a whitening agent. A lot of people had it in paints and stuff in hardware stores. They didn't die. So then they moved titanium dioxide, you'll see it in sunblocks and things, into cosmetics. Nobody died. So now you'll see it in a lot of food. It's used in a whitening agent as food. No one has actually studied whether we should be eating it, but it's approved under the generally recognized as safe principle. By contrast, the EU uses what's called the precautionary principle, which is there is some evidence that this could be dangerous, and so we're going to take it out of the food supply until we know that it's safe. And so there are about 1,200 compounds that are allowed in American food that are not allowed in food in the EU. And just to give you one example of that, potassium bromate, which is a compound that helps dough rise, is permitted in the United States. It's a suspected carcinogen. All that work has been done in rats and mice, so we haven't tested it in humans. It's banned in the EU. It's banned in China. It's banned in Brazil. But it's permitted in the United States, and if you look for it, sometimes you'll see potassium bromate, but sometimes if you're looking at baked goods, you won't see it at all. What you'll see is brominated flour. And if you see brominated flour, that tells you that potassium bromate was used in the process. We don't actually have, and this is something that I tend to thump my hands about sometimes, but we have labels. That's thanks to Harvey Wiley and the Food and Drug Law. The labels are not as transparent as I think they should be. Brominated flour is one example of that, but there are others. Hang on, I just want to fix this little microphone. So another example is cellulose. You'll see cellulose quite often, especially if you buy pre-grated cheese. They'll put cellulose in there to keep the cheese from clumping. That's usually wood pulp. And so I've started thinking to myself, well, okay, but what tree am I eating, right? And so it's a silly example, but I would like the labels to be so transparent that I would like to know that with my cheddar I'm getting oak and with my Parmesan I'm getting pine, right? Or whatever it is I'm actually eating, because the label is not going to tell me. In the same way that you sometimes see on labels natural flavorings, what you probably don't know is the U.S. government and the FDA actually doesn't define natural. So the natural flavorings don't have to be natural at all. And they often are not, right? They may have some derivative from a plant in them, but the actual flavoring can be whatever a company puts in it. So I'd like to just make the point that people put a lot of pressure on consumers to say be an informed consumer, but it's really difficult to be an informed consumer if you're not getting the information you need. Having said that, the estimates by the CDC are that about 3,000 Americans every day are killed just from food, right? 3,000 Americans a year. 3,000 a day would be pretty lethal, sorry. 3,000 a year, that's a very small percentage of the number of deaths in this country, and that tells you that food is a whole lot safer than it was in the 19th century when it was one of the top 10 causes of death, right? So we're moving forward. At the moment, we have a safety system in place, and my last point is just a cautionary point, which is at this moment we're also undoing that protective system in some substantive ways. And the two examples I want to mention are the turning back over to meat production companies of meat inspection. You probably saw that we are going to, the U.S. government just agreed that pork producers can do most of their own inspections and also increase the number of carcasses that go through a plant. I think they're almost going to double the number of carcasses that can go through a plant on a given day, and they're going to reduce the number of federal inspectors by, I want to say, 40%. And the beef industry, and they're moving toward the same thing with the beef industry. I mean, this is basically where we were before the jungle, right? So we're rolling that back. The Food Safety Modernization Act, which was passed in 2011, is almost entirely not being enforced. There are parts of it that are, but there are much of it that isn't. So it's important for me to say these things. I think we say regulation in a derogatory sense, right? In the United States, a lot of times regulation is seen as a pejorative, but what we're really talking about is consumer protection. Right. And I think we need to remember that that is what we're talking about when we're talking about regulation. Regulation can be better, it can be smarter, it can be applied more efficiently. I'm not arguing with any of that, but bedrock, this is where the government takes my side, and I'm not, or your side, and says, we're here to look out for you in these ways, and we want to keep that. And we want and should value people like a Harvey Wiley who go out and fight for these kinds of principles at great personal cost. And as Chancellor Blank says, make the point that a single person who cares can change the world. Thank you so much. Oh, this thing is making me nuts. Thanks so much.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Hemant Shah. I'm the director of the School of Journalism and Mass Communication. An old friend of Deb's. She used to be in the School of Journalism. We were colleagues for 18 years before she left for MIT, and I want to ask, why did you leave? So I'm going to be the moderator for the question and answer session, and there's a couple of microphones, I believe, in the aisles. So if you have a question, please line up in an orderly fashion. and we'll take turns asking Deborah questions. While that's happening, maybe I can just say thanks, Deb, for that really engaging talk.
Thank you.
It's such a timely and important topic, and it's always in the news. It seems like ever since I read your book, I seem to see more stories
Yeah.
in the papers. So, is there anybody that has a question that would like to kick it off? Yeah, why don't you? So, since you didn't go
I
to the
think they're
microphone,
recording, Gail, if you... Oh, so the question was, am I going to be doing a PBS special? And the answer is yes. So,
oh, good.
The American Experience has been working on the film of this book all year. And the last I talked to the producer, it's going to be the premiere episode when they start in January. So just I'm super curious to see how that turns out.
Yeah, that's great news. The Poisoner's Handbook was a fantastic
They did a
show
great
too,
job
so
with
this is going to
that.
be a good follow-up.
And this is entirely different, but a couple books earlier than this, I did a book on ghost hunting at the turn of the 20th century, and that is going to be part of a 6-part series on Netflix.
Wow.
On the secrets, or the story of the quest to find out if we live after death. So I'm a little worried about how I'm going to come off in that one, but I already filmed that. I've already filmed both of them. So it doesn't look like there's a bunch of questions, though. Are there any other questions?
Any other questions? Yeah, there's. Can you speak up real loud? Or come to the mic, okay.
Yes. So the question is, can I comment on dietary supplements, which are some of the worst regulated things in the United States of America? So, I mean, one of the things we see with dietary supplements, and certainly it played out in a very different way with vaping, is what is the role of the FDA in regulating dietary supplements? What happened, and I want to say it was in 1992 or 1993, up until about that point, the FDA was fairly aggressively moving to regulate dietary supplements. What goes in them? Has it been safety tested? Has it actually been tested for efficacy? All of those things. And in the early 90s, the supplement industry, by the early 90s, the supplement industry had realized that they really hated being regulated. And so they made a big push for a law. It's called DSHEA, is the acronym, which somewhere in there is dietary supplements. And that law, they put, and I think the numbers I've heard was that they gave $100 million to Congress to pass that law. I know Herbalife was a huge funder of the push to pass DSHEA, and DSHEA completely undid everything the FDA had been doing in regulating supplements. So dietary supplements remain largely unregulated at this point, and they are, often completely untrustworthy, sometimes unsafe, and often untrustworthy. And it was interesting because I was down at the FDA this fall, but gave a talk at the USDA at the National Agricultural Library in the spring about this book, and they were talking about the research they were doing with dietary supplements. And one of the points they made is that they'd been particularly looking at the delivery system. So you have, say, vitamin D, right? What's the system? What's the sort of chemical complex that you put that into that's going to deliver that so there's actual uptake from the body? And as it turned out, every one of the delivery systems they had looked at were insoluble, which meant that these things just go right through you, right? So you're paying, $15 or more for a bottle of pricey vitamin D, and you're just peeing it out, right? It's actually not being absorbed. And they said what was really frustrating to them is all that information is there. And when they look at the website, probably buried somewhere deep at the FDA, I'm not exactly sure, but people just weren't seeing it. And so they didn't feel that the fact that they were doing all this work on delivery systems was actually having any effect on whether people were using supplements or not. And you probably saw some of the research later that came out regarding don't take too much calcium, it's not as safe as we think, which is different from are you going to spend a lot of money on vitamin D when you're not actually going to absorb it, right? So it's been surprising to me because as a sort of what do I do when I hear this information, I don't take any dietary supplements, right? I just started thinking, why am I wasting money on something that is just running through my body? Now, if there was someone from the dietary supplement industry, they would probably make a very different case than me. But I've gotten very pragmatic about this. And when I talk to my own doctor and I say, I don't take any supplement, because your doctor will say, well, what do you take? And then I say, well, I don't take any vitamins because what's the point, right? If there wasn't DSHEA and if there was actually solid evidence that these worked or that we absorbed them in any meaningful way, I'd be inhaling them. But I haven't seen that. Well, maybe not inhaling them, but I'd certainly be using them. But now I'm like, I can spend my money on better things than some supplement that is going to do nothing for me. And until I see the evidence that it does, I'm not doing it. I think there are prescription forms, this is a long answer to your question, of some things like vitamin D for people who really have serious bone problems, and so I'm not arguing with that, but I can tell you that I don't trust any of the over-the-counter stuff, and I know it's completely unregulated. In the same way that I know if you looked at, there was a book that came out earlier this year called Bottle of Lies about the generic drug industry, in which you could look at all the ways that the FDA was not actually inspecting generics, right? And you've probably seen these recalls of things like Zantac recently, right? Same exact kind of problem where we're just not seeing that protective net operating the way it should. And I want to say this, we actually have very good, not the supplements, the supplement, that law needs to be redone, right? But we have other very good protective laws, we just don't enforce them, and we don't fund them. So, for instance, if you look at the money that goes to the FDA and the USDA for inspections, it's fairly equal. I think that I'm spitballing these numbers. They just increased the amount of money that went to the FDA, but I want to say each of them gets about $1 billion a year or so for inspections, in that ballpark. But the USDA inspects 8,000 facilities, and the FDA inspects 100,000 for the same amount of money. So when the FSMA passed, the Food Safety Modernization Act, in 2011, one of the things when you get into the fine print of that is it requires that critical food processing facilities get inspected every 5 years, which is not enough. Right? But of course that's not happening right now because FSMA is being defunded. So, we actually need to enforce and fund some of the things we have in place. We don't just need to write new regulation. I mean, obviously we do for supplements, that's my opinion, but some of it is that we just need to use the good rules we have in place and actually give them some support, and they would protect us more. That's a long answer to your supplement question.
There's a question back here.
Yes.
Yeah.
As soon as you used the term titanium, I remember so well, back in the 60s, back when the Cold War was really, really, really going, I was in the Air Force, and I remember being in a storage place in Kansas, near Wichita, Kansas, and I had to go through this area to get to my plane.
Yeah.
And as I was going through this hangar, there's a big sign, titanium, titanium, and an arrow paint. Don't go in this area. It's poisonous. It's titanium. And they use titanium in intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so when you mentioned that, I never will forget that sign being saying titanium poisonous and an arrow.
Wow.
Did you have a question?
Yes, I mean, so one of the things, because I am a writer that spends a lot of time writing about poisonous things, is this weird dance we do in which we know things are poisonous and we make use of them anyway. and we mix them up in different ways and pretend that they don't have a track record, right? I haven't seen, I haven't actually looked at the toxicity data on just pure titanium, but now you make me want to take a look. I don't, a serious look. There is, guys, there's a great website. If you're ever curious about something, it's, let me see if I can remember it, astdr.cdc.gov. And that is the website in which CDC posts information about known toxic substances. And you can actually go to that website and input something you're interested in and get the toxicity data for it. It's like this amazing unknown resource. Yeah, you have a question.
Do you think products like almond milk and Impossible Burgers are deceiving the public with their claims and labels even though they aren't coming from lactating or live animals?
I think the public is smart enough to figure out, right, that almond milk didn't come from a cow. And I know that the dairy industry, I know they passed a law early in North Carolina saying that you couldn't call soy milk milk, right? I mean, to me, that's just a advertising, marketing distraction, right? I'd be much more interested in having someone say, well, what are the ingredients, right? I found myself, I mean, I will tell you, doing this kind of work makes me an insane label reader. I'm actually that, like, annoying middle-aged woman in the grocery store who's sitting there reading down the label. And I was in CVS the other day, and I saw that L'Oreal, had like a little kind of holder where they had ingredients. They didn't have the ingredients on the actual cosmetics, but you could pick up the ingredients. And then when you opened up this long streamer of ingredients, it didn't tell you what it was. It said product G7560. I mean, I saw ferric cyanide in one of these product ingredients. I mean, it's an inorganic, ferric arsenic, sorry. It's inorganic, so it's not, inorganic arsenic's not that. Actually, inorganic arsenic's terrible. What am I saying? But I saw, and I knew this anyway, we put a lot of heavy metals into lipstick. There was manganese, there was chromium. Both of those are used, you know, to color cosmetics. We just don't know this stuff, right? You can actually go, I should tell you, to the FDA website, and they have a whole section on lipstick and all the heavy metals in lipstick. So a lot of it is that information's there, and it's not conveyed effectively, and a lot of it is that we haven't taken the time to really look at the toxicity. Yeah.
So speaking of meat, that makes me raise another question, and your book is an incredible dive into toxicity and what do chemicals and harmful things do to individuals, but now we have much more awareness of the broader impacts of food on our system and things that can affect us indirectly when you think about raising meat and the energy and water and land use degradation to raise a kilogram of protein from meat versus from legumes. What about those types of full life assessments of food on ourselves and our population more broadly?
I think that's a really important issue, and there's certainly, I've seen more recently some detailed and very useful reporting on the effect of raising beef in climate change, for instance, right? And I just saw a really interesting look at some of the fires in the Amazon. You remember there was a lot of coverage about fires in the Amazon, and when people really drilled that down, the two factors in those fires were beef and soybeans, right? So I don't think that we always look in the way that we should at the environmental effects of big corporate farming and things like meat production on the health of the planet, right? We think of it as more local. We think of it as an ethical choice. I don't eat meat, right, because I don't believe in eating animals. But we don't look at often enough, I think, at that big picture impact of changing agricultural habits. And we're seeing, for instance, just to give you an example of how I think this is so tightly connected, as you know, we've been in a trade war with China over things like soybeans. So we're not growing as many soybeans because they're not being sold. China's not buying the way we used to. So that production is moving to places like Brazil. And to grow the soybeans there, they have to clear the rainforest, right? And so all of those decisions, the political decisions, are connected to the food production decisions and are connected to the environmental decision. I mean, there's so many pieces of this. I came here on an airplane, right? That's a guilt-inducing thing in the era of climate change. So, and I know that there are environmental scientists like Catherine Hayhoe who try to do most of their meetings by Skype or Zoom because they just don't want to get on an airplane. I think we're at a point where we are going to have to be really honest with ourselves about these decisions. And it's not so different. And, I mean, not that I am able to, influence the national policy on soybeans. I'm not. But, sadly, because I'm sure I'd be brilliant at it. But but I do think that we need to have these conversations. And I was talking about this book and some of the food issues in Chicago, and there was a woman there from one of the big distribution companies for wine and beer and food in the United States. And I actually know this company distributes a lot of wines that I like. And she said, how are you going to get companies to, not just government and individuals, how are you going to get companies to behave better if the government isn't laying down these standards? And she said, it's got to be consumers. You're going to have to start voting with your pocketbooks. You're going to have to say, I'm not going to buy that, right? I'm not going to eat that. I'm not going to pay for that. And so how much of a difference that makes, I don't know. But I do know that consumers can really shift an industry in some profoundly important ways if they make that decision. Yeah.
I found it really interesting with the whole Heinz saga.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, in your research, did you encounter any other players who saw that as a benevolent thing or whether it was an opportunity?
Well, I mean, Heinz was, really stood out because he was so far out there, but there were some other companies. Interestingly enough, the American canning industry, and Wiley went and spoke at a national meeting of the American canning industry, and at first they were very hostile, but then they actually started to come on board. And some of the millers, actually, and some of the grocers, right? There were small other pockets. There was no one as high profile as Heinz, but you did see some real push by people like canners who were starting to say, and this actually influenced Heinz too, who were starting to say, this goes back to my point about consumers, people aren't buying our products because they don't trust them, right? And so we actually are going to have to fix this or we're going to lose a significant market share. And I did read one piece about Heinz that said that one of the things that he considered, aside from the wonders of pure food, was that they were starting to see a consumer shift back to home canning because food was so bad, and he wanted to get ahead of that. So I do think there were these pockets, and it's really important for me to not oversimplify and say all industry is bad, right? And all people who are involved in these different aspects are bent on evil, because I don't think that's true, right? But the people who really plant their feet and say, I want to do this better, tend to stand out. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could share things about regulations of public school lunch programs, and then also if you have an opinion on colleges that require meal plans, because when we have those, we don't always get the information of the meals we would be buying.
Right. I mean, the federal government's meal plan policies and school lunch plan policies have shifted a lot over time. I'm old enough to remember when there was a huge brouhaha because Ronald Reagan, speaking of ketchup, The Reagan administration suggested ketchup was an adequate vegetable in the public school lunches, right? I mean, and it does have some tomato in it, so. But I haven't really looked at that closely. One of the things I do know, I grew up in the Deep South. And one of the things I do know from growing up in the Deep South in the very poor state of Louisiana is that a lot of the public school lunch programs were government surplus foods, right? So the government would buy a lot of different products from farmers that they weren't selling, and then they would revise the standards for school lunches to use those up. So I can tell you, this is probably not a great answer to your question, but it's an interesting anecdote, that when I was in elementary school in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, we ate more prunes than any other state. We had prunes at every single lunch, and I have never eaten them since I got out of elementary school, and I never will again. So, yeah.
When you were talking about school lunches, I had looked at the ingredients for bread at one point, about 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And I pursued it through the Food and Drug Administration about why there's all these calcium and sodium salts. And they got back to me and they said, well, it's USDA, first of all. And secondly, they said that they have these approved salts as leavening salts as a replacement for yeast and for leavening bread.
Oh, that's interesting.
So they had this list of all these approved extra ingredients that were never in bread before. But I think that the companies making bread like Sara Lee and other companies have started to try to reduce their addition of these salts, but because I do see a reduced amount of it in
because
bread now.
of the concerns about a high sodium diet, right?
Might be that response.
And there's it's aziocarbamide. Am I saying that right? Someone who knows that probably will tell me if I'm mispronouncing that. But that's a leavening agent that they use also in bread, and it's also famously used people in yoga mats, right? It causes bubbles, right? And it was interesting because I was looking at that. That's another thing that's banned in the EU and permitted in the US in bread. And what you start to see again is the consumer influence. The story I was looking at that, and it was looking at potassium bromide. And the reporter had contacted Swanson, right? Swanson used a lot of the kind of things you're talking about, but also brominated flour in their pot pies, which I grew up eating also. And they said they were going to take it out. So you do see and this is why I think it's really important to get this information out there. If it becomes public, then you get public pressure on companies, right? And the other thing I will say about food safety, and almost everyone I've talked to in the food safety business has said this, is that the other thing that works for us in the United States is lawsuits and loss of brand. So you may remember, for instance, the big food outbreak at Chipotle. It took them years to and they may not yet have done that. So there is that kind of pressure on companies. Jack in a Box with E. coli, right? In the late 20th century. There was the Peanut Corporation of America, right? I think that peanut, which led to the Food Safety Modernization Act, but that guy went to prison, right? So there are other mechanisms in place that, try to counterbalance better food nutrition. But the one thing I believe, and I'm a longtime journalist, is, except for mushrooms, nothing really goes well in the dark. So the more we get that information out there, the better off we all are. We want this to be public. We want this information to be public, right? It needs to be out there, and it needs to be generating pressure to do the right thing. And just briefly to hark back to Harvey Wiley, that was basically one of the things he realized. He needed it to be out there, and he needed the public pressure, yeah.
Deborah, let's take two more questions. There's one person here, then one on this side, too.
Okay. So this is a follow-up on just what you said. You talk about the consumers being the people who can move government, hopefully, as voters, yes. But the question is, who's going to move the consumers? And of course, for that, I look to people like you and Professor Shaw. And I'm wondering what in both of your schools is happening in terms of journalists getting this information out, and what are you doing in the schools to, this book is incredible, but it really is. I think it should be required reading in every high school, frankly. But how about getting it out to the hinterlands that these things are happening? Anyhow, what is happening in the schools of journalism?
I mean, that's a very fair point, and Hemet, you may want to address that from the University of Wisconsin. When I was here, I taught a class in investigative reporting. I mean, I believe that good, independent journalistic inquiry is one of the most important things we do, right? There is no strong democracy without a watchdog media. I mean, it goes way beyond my particular subject here, and the more we do to train journalists to think that way and to be fearless in inquiry and to stand up to power the way good journalism does, the better off we all are. And I think we all get that. We certainly taught that here at the University of Wisconsin. The Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism is, in fact, headquartered in the journalism school here. And one of the things they do, it's a wonderful program, is that they reach out to small publications all across the state of Wisconsin and who don't have the staff to do good investigations, and they say, what do you think needs to be told? What are the stories that are not getting told, and how can we support that? And so you'll see their stories, across many publications in Wisconsin, but also outside of Wisconsin, and they certainly, when I was working with them, we did a lot of work looking at water quality in Wisconsin, right, which was a really important thing. Yeah. So investigative journalism is our friend, guys. It's not, it's not the enemy of the people. You want journalists to get out there and stand up for what's right and do the job that needs to be done and tell these stories. And I say that all the time. I really do, and I think Professor Shaw would say the same.
Well, Deborah did a great deal to establish a tradition of investigative journalism in our school. She mentioned the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism, but also there's it's not a center exactly, but it's called the Madison Commons. It's a website where students actually go out and do what we call hyper-local reporting, not only in the community, but out in, as you say, the hinterlands, and they bring those stories back. These are students now being trained to do the kind of work that Deborah has done, for a career's worth. So we're doing our part to get that done, but covering rural areas is difficult. Deborah would agree. I think that's like the news deserts out there. We're trying to take care of that.
That's really daunting. Another journalism school that does a great job with that is the University of Georgia. They have a health reporting program, and they actually send their students out every year into super rural Georgia areas that never get covered and look at health care and different issues in those parts of Georgia. And the woman who runs that, who's a professor at Georgia, told me that they went to one part, I want to say it's Albany. In Georgia, Albany is pronounced Albany, so just when you go down there, not to give yourself away, you should never say Albany if you're in Albany, Georgia. But she said that they were in an area in which one of the students came up to her and said, I had never seen this kind of poverty anywhere else except China. And so we don't see those stories because they don't get covered, right? There's a fabulous story called, I think the title is I Think They've Forgotten Us in the Washington Post right now. But have you seen this one? Oh, it's so good. Everyone should read it. About a little African-American community in Alabama that's trying to gin up the wherewithal to have a plywood boot in a parade in the county so that people will remember them they're there. And it's just phenomenal storytelling. And we want journalists to do that. We want journalists to go out everywhere. And Hemet is right that the loss of small newspapers around the country is something that we're really going to have to figure out a cure for, because who is going to tell those stories if the journalists aren't there? And there was one other question.
Yeah, would you like to? No, okay, all right. So Let me ask one last
Yes.
question.
Okay.
Are there any Dr. Wileys out there right now, given what's happening in the FDA and the attack on evidence-based science and so forth?
Not enough,
Not enough,
right?
yeah.
Does anyone stand out for any of you? I know individual scientists who I think are really making a difference and standing up. But that kind of national public figure, this kind of lightning rod of science matters and we will do it, there's not enough of those people out there at this point.
All right,
Thanks.
well.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Deborah. And welcome back to Madison.
Yeah, I'm
Voice
just,
okay?
yeah. Talk, yeah, so.
That was such a great talk.
Oh.